Hi everyone, welcome to the Wheel of Mind, the Wheel of Time point of view reread podcast. In this bonus season, we're reading perspectives from some of Matt Cawthon's friends. Welcome to season 2.5, episode 2, where we're finishing up the perspective of Master Bard Thom Moiraine. I'm your co-host, Lajara Dane of the White Aja.
Hi, and I'm Giskel Cimaris, a scholar from Ilion. For any new listeners to our series, I want to remind you that the Wheel of Mind is an in-depth character reread podcast, and we do drop spoilers at random times, so this is your only spoiler warning. Today we're examining chapters 4 and 17 from The Shadow Rising, and as well chapters 44 and 48 from A Memory of Light.
Awesome. Before we begin our chapter summaries and discussion, I wanted to remind our listeners of what Thom has been up to, since he has no point of view chapters in The Dragon Reborn, and we're skipping to The Shadow Rising today. So the next time that we see him, after his assurance that he is a danger to no one when he goes off to kill Galdrian, the next time we see him is through Matt's eyes. He is quite drunk at the time. He reminds us that he's killed Galdrian, and he reminisces about having loved Morghese and Dina. Matt gets him to come along on his adventure to take a letter from Elaine to Morghese, where Matt finds out about a plot to kill Elaine and Nynaeve. He also learns some of Thom's history with Morghese and Caemlyn from Basil Gill at the Queen's Blessing. They head to Tyr as soon as they can. Matt kills Comar, who had been sent to do the deed, and he rescues the girls from the Stone of Tyr. This is when Juilin becomes a supporting character in his story. And since the recovery from the bad cough he had when they first got there, Thom has been living in servants' quarters in the stone and trying his best not to be noticed as anything more than a gleeman. And this is just where we find him in our first chapter for today's episode, The Shadow Rising Chapter 4, called Strings. This chapter finds Thom in the wee hours of the morning, admiring a note he just forged from the High Lord Carleon to High Lord Tedosian's wife, the Lady Altima, implying an affair between Altima and Carleon. He plans to place his handiwork where Tedosian could easily find it, and assume Altima had carelessly left it. Just then, Matt knocks on the door, and Thom says he needs a moment to put on a shirt as he hides the letter in his writing box under the table. Matt seems distressed about something, and Thom assumes it's about a woman. He decides to treat it as a normal visit, though, until Matt opens up about what's bothering him. He offers to bet on a stones game, thinking it has too much of a pattern for the boy's uncanny luck to dominate, but Matt's not in the mood for that. Matt asks if Rand had gone mad, and when Thom doesn't know what he's talking about, Matt spills the story about the playing cards trying to kill him earlier that night, and about wanting to leave Tyr. Thom himself had considered leaving and finding a nice, quiet village far away from all this business, but that would leave Rand with only Moiraine to help his politicking, and the potential Aes Sedai control of the boy left Thom uneasy. His history with Owen made him want to intervene, but on the other hand, he ought not to be mixed up in this. It's really none of his business. He thought of asking to perform a song for Rand so he could talk to him no matter which way he decided, despite having mentioned that clean break in our last episode. He's just sick to his stomach with all this inner conflict, but he keeps a straight face for Matt and points out that the boy has been talking about leaving since the day they got there. Matt speaks some of Thom's own thoughts aloud about wanting to go somewhere quiet away from it all, but Moiraine is always watching him, so he can't. And other things always come up, like the gambling and the women. When Thom offers to point out another reason for his staying, Matt threatens to leave if he says the word ta'veren, so Thom wisely changes his sentence midstream to refer to his friendship with Rand instead. Perhaps Matt doesn't want to abandon him. Matt shakes that suggestion off right away. He'd be smart to get away as soon as he could, but could Moiraine be keeping him here with the power? Thom is privately convinced it's a ta'veren thing, but doesn't press the issue, and he tells Matt he doesn't think that's likely. He also professes to be no good at giving advice, so he suggests that Matt ask Moiraine, or maybe even Nynaeve instead, both of which Matt finds absolutely ludicrous. No, he's going to leave tonight. How about a game of stones first, though? Thom asks, to which the boy agrees. And at that, Matt seems totally distracted by the game and Thom's stories, and Thom is content to help Matt for the moment, even if he can do little for Rand. And thus ends Chapter 4, Strings.
To me, this chapter really reinforces Thom's dark past, his history. Now, when we say his dark past, Thom is a good character. If this were Dungeons and Dragons, he would definitely be good. He would not be evil or chaotic or anything. He's probably maybe a neutral good. That's just a generalization of his personality. Thom wants to do good things. He wants to stay out of the limelight at this time in his life. He's had power. He's had glory, he's had fame. He knew how to deal with it, but he knew how to break away from it when he had to as well. But now we see him pulling up some of those things that he used from the game of houses, some of the maneuverings, political maneuverings that he's used before, and he does it in some very devious ways. Now, he has ultimately a good aim here, or a good goal. His goal is to try to just break up the power of those high lords who don't like Rand. Some of them are actually plotting against him, and Thom has found out about this, and so he's trying to distract them away from that. So yeah, this really brings that up of how Thom is not the kind of person to just, his first instinct is to go evil or do bad things to people or try to interfere in politics. But if he's pushed into it, he will. And he will take it much further than they wanted him to. We see this in our last episode where he went after King Galdrian of Cairhien. We see this here, how he's going after some of these high lords, not directly. I mean, his fingerprints are not going to be on any bloody daggers. Instead, Thom is doing this very indirectly and in such ways that no one can implicate him in it, which is very good, but shows he has a very devious mind when he needs to have.
I think it's interesting that this is the first time we see him do something like this on page, too. We saw that he was dangerous when he was able to defend himself in his inn room in Cairhien in our last episode, and we saw that it was heavily implied he was about to go kill Galdrian, and then we get it confirmed for us later that is what happened. So we knew he was dangerous. That was when we learned it. But here we see it happen on page. We see he's not done with it. He doesn't actually want to be out of it, like he said, He's sort of like Matt, where he keeps doing one thing and saying another. He keeps talking, thinking to himself about how he needs to get out of this web of Rand's mess that's all around him. Yet he keeps staying, and not only staying, but he's collecting information. He's planting information. He is, like you said, trying to break up their power here. And so he feels some conflict internally. Instead of there being this clean break between thinking one thing and doing another one, kind of like Matt, he's thinking both of them and arguing with himself and then does one of them. But he still has this very, like Matt, he's got this very different current going on underneath the surface compared to the face that he shows to who he's talking to. And we see this in just how he thinks paragraphs before he even replies to Matt with a simple sentence. So we just see more of his complexity here, and it was really cool to catch him in the act in this chapter because this may be one of the only times we get to do that as well, at least from his point of view. Now, we see effects of what he's done. We see him get into fights and things like that. And this is not the end of his intrigue, but I just find it pretty funny that we catch him doing it, and he doesn't. No one's asking him to do this. Nobody is forcing him to do this. He's getting involved in Rand's political life, and he keeps trying to justify it to himself or decide how much he wants to be involved. But he's so much deeper in this than he seems to want to acknowledge to himself.
Yes, absolutely. And when you were speaking of his ability to be dangerous, remember in the Eye of the World, he charged a Myrddraal.
Yes, true.
Not That's just true. Stood off against it, fought defensively. He charged at a Myrddraal, which is not only reckless and suicidal, but something that very few people would have survived,
or would have even attempted.
Now, the fact that he did, and the fact that he did not kill it is, kind of negligible. Just the fact that he took it on really shows his bravery and how dangerous he can be when he has to be.
That also, that's more evidence for his Matt-like heroism too, because who would choose to do something like that? And you can imagine in his thoughts, he would have complained about how he's gotten involved with these boys and involved in Aes Sedai stuff he never wanted to be mixed up in again. And I just see a lot of parallels between him and Matt.
Yes, I definitely do. As well, some things about this chapter and this is not directly related to Thom, but somewhat indirectly. It seems that at this point in the story, it's reinforced that no one really appreciates Moiraine and everything she's doing. They begin to much more after she's gone. But at this point, Thom really doesn't appreciate it. Matt does not appreciate her. Rand does not appreciate her. They all seem like they want to be free of her and her quote unquote Aes Sedai manipulations. In fact, this the title of this chapter, Strings, refers to the strings that are tied to each of these people, pulling them in different ways, different directions. They feel like they are being manipulated by her. What they don't see is she's not manipulating them for her ends.
Right.
She's not really manipulating them to make them to be whom she wants them to be. She's trying as much as anything to be. Think of it as a coach in soccer or some other sport, where the coach really has to push the players to be more than they currently are. And you see that universally. You see this with good teachers, college professors. You see this with good supervisors and managers. You see this especially with coaches, and that's why we use that analogy quite often. Is they find someone at the level they are, and they find ways to bring out what's better in the players and the workers and the students, whatever the case may be. But you have to push them to do that. People don't just take one word of encouragement and suddenly, go beyond what they were capable of before. You can't bring out the greatness in a person until you force them to do more than they want to do. And that's what Moiraine is doing here. She's forcing them to do things they don't want to do so they can realize their own power, so they can take their own agency in this story and be their own people. Now, again, she does have a vision of how the prophecies are supposed to play out, of how things are supposed to work, and that vision is not realized because, like most people, we can only see one small part of the pattern. We can't see all of it. So I'm not saying her ways are perfect or her ways are right, but at this point she is pushing them for a reason, not just to be pushy, but to see them become better, and again, take their own agency in the story. So I think she's doing it for a good reason, but at this point in the story, no one appreciates her. I did notice Thom thought of Moiraine several times in this chapter. She came to mind, and mentally he thought of her several times. I don't remember him actually speaking out loud about her until Matt brought her up. But he did think of her several times in this chapter. So she's in his head to some degree, but right now he still can't quite see beyond the fact that she's Aes Sedai.
Right.
So there's something intriguing about the woman Moiraine, but that role of Aes Sedai, it overwhelms that.
Yes.
So I like that dichotomy, and we see that shift a little more in my upcoming chapter.
Yes, true. I think it's interesting that he suggested Matt go to her for advice. I wonder why he did that, if it was something to steer him away from her even more, like, one of those reverse psychology type moves, or what the purpose of that was. I'm not really sure.
Yeah. As soon as he said it, I knew in my mind he knows Matt will not do that.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of those pieces of advice you can give safely. It is good advice. It is exactly what should happen, but they're not going to follow it. So they're not going to blame you later if the advice backfires, because you tell them the right thing, but they're not going to do it. So it's one of those safe advice things. I think it's just sort of an excuse to basically put it out there. This is what you need to do. You're not going to do it, so you'll quit whining about it.
Yeah.
That's how I read the situation. And one little tidbit I see in this, I guess it is because of Thom's age and the wisdom that can come with age. I don't know that that's automatic, but it can. Is Moiraine is not the only person who sees the potential of these young people. There's a quote in there, I think it's just 2 or 3 paragraphs before the end of the chapter, when he's thinking about Matt himself. He's facing Matt. Matt has finally acceded to the game of stones, and Thom thinks, I've distracted him very easily. A moment ago he was determined to leave. Now he's determined to stay, at least for the night. But he said this quote, "A greatness he refused to recognize, clinging to his back." End quote. So he sees a greatness about Matt that I had never caught that before in my rereads or other studies or our Matt focused chapter. I had not caught that any of those times until now. And it's really an awesome concept that he sees something in Matt that really very few other people see at this point. And I don't know that he's working to bring that out in Matt the way that Moiraine is trying to do with all of our Emmons Fielders, but he at least recognizes it.
Yeah.
And I would love to see him explain that to Nynaeve. That would be that would be a fun conversation, would it not?
Yeah. There's one more thing Thom does in this chapter that
yes.
Makes me wonder why. He asks Matt to stay for the Stones game at the end. When Matt says, I'm leaving right now, he says, well, no hurry. You don't need to leave in the middle of the night. Just stay for one Stones game, and you can leave in the morning. Why do you think he does this?
Just my opinion is he knows it's the Taveran pull that is keeping Matt there, or he suspects that at least.
Yeah.
And he can't say it because Matt has already said, yep. I will turn and leave. You do not breathe a word of that.
It's got an ultimatum.
Yes, I'm tired of hearing that. I think he's just giving him another excuse to stay at least one more night, to let Matt and circumstances and the pattern change Matt's mind because he knows he's not going to. So yeah, just give him the excuse to start out relaxing a few minutes, but it's so late at night or early in the morning, according to the perspective, that he's not going to leave at that moment. Tomorrow, there will be another reason. There'll be another excuse if it really is Taveran pull. So it just help him calm down for this moment, and tomorrow will take care of itself. That was my take on it. I may be wrong, but
that's very similar to my take. I was thinking at first that Thom would want to help Matt escape because Thom himself keeps thinking about how he wants to be out of it. And he wants to help Matt, who seems really confused about what he wants, so it seems like he would want to accompany Matt. Thom himself doesn't want to go running off in the middle of the night. And so I think he wants to stick close to Matt. It seems like he wants to be able to help this confused young man more so than Rand, because I think Rand feels a little out of his hands at this point. Mm-hmm. And so I think he would want to go with Matt. He wants to leave too. He's been thinking about why he hasn't left yet. And he just is a little too old to be running around doing this stuff in the middle of the night, especially as he discovered in The Dragon Reborn when he got sick doing this kind of stuff. Yes. So I think that's why, and like you said, he strongly suspects that they wouldn't be able to leave anyway. So I think it's probably partially Rand's Taveran that gets Thom to even suggest staying for tonight, because the Taveran will inevitably cause even more delays. But I think it's planting itself in Thom's decision making too.
Yes. Oh, I didn't think of that as it being the Taveran pull from Rand that is helping Thom make these decisions. But yeah, I could see it affecting both of them. Matt can feel it more, mm-hmm. but perhaps Thom can recognize it easier or admit it easier.
Yeah, okay. I think so. But those were about all the notes I had on this chapter. Yeah. Did you have any other points?
No, that's same here. I've gone through all of those. So, all right, without anything further, I will lead us into the Shadow Rising chapter 17, entitled Deceptions. Thom wandered around the Stone of Tyr, juggling and talking to working servants to, quote, raise people's spirits, end quote, after tonight's Trolloc attack. Well, technically it was last night's Trolloc attack. It seemed that Thom had been up until after dawn. Among the juggling, though, he asked questions, all questions designed to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the common people, doubt against the nobles. Thom wanted the people to favor the Lord Dragon over the Lords of Tyr. He realized that he was doing it all clumsily, at least for Thom it was clumsy. Thom was just too tired. He was too old, too tired to be up all night, night after night, plotting and scheming. So he headed back to his room. When he opened his door, Thom was surprised to find Moiraine there, going through the papers and things he had laying out, just as if she had some right to be there. She didn't look ashamed at all. They began some small talk as Thom wondered if he had anything left that was incriminating in that writing case. I mean, it was locked, but she is Aes Sedai, and wondered whether or not she had opened it already to see. Of course, there was nothing important left out in the papers scattered in his room. Servants' quarters had no locks on the doors. Moiraine began talking to him about his old knee injury, and while he was distracted, she healed him of his pain and fatigue. Now, the knee injury remained, though it hurt less right now. Thom refused to acknowledge the gift, since Moiraine had refused to ask him if he wanted it. Then their banter turned to one of the High Lords who had been killed yesterday in a hunting accident. The one who had done it had then fallen ill and was being tended by his wife. Thom feigned ignorance rather than innocence. Moiraine looked amused. She began to recite a bit of Thom's own history back to him. Court bard of Camlin and Morghase's once lover. She even mentioned the strange timing of Taringail's death. Thom hid his shock and recited a bit of her own history back to her, calling her the Lady Moiraine of House Damodred of Cairhien. Unfazed, Moiraine explained that her last name was very unpopular for a good reason. King Laemon and her other uncles had done much to tarnish the reputation of their noble lineage. Finished with all the hidden meanings of the discussion, Thom asked her outright what she wanted of him. Moiraine explained that Nynaeve and Elaine were leaving for Tanchico, and she wanted Thom to accompany them and watch out for them. Thom equivocated, stating that he had thought about retiring to a quiet farm life. He had no interest at all in Tanchico. That place was a madhouse. What he was interested in, however, was protecting Rand, and it looked like Moiraine was trying to separate him from Rand. Then Moiraine hit him with a little bit more of his own history. His nephew, Owen. Owen had been gentled by a group of Red Sisters without a trial in Torvalen, as they were supposed to have done, and left him to the mercies, quote-unquote, of the local townsfolk. Moiraine offered him the names of those Red Sisters in exchange for Thom watching over the girls. She gave him her promise, straight out, with no possibility of lies or deception, that he would survive the trip to Tanchico, and that she would see him again. Then she left him with this statement: "I will teach you that not all Aes Sedai are like those Reds, Thom. You must learn that." End quote. Thom broke down after she left, crying with pain, regret, and frustration. It seemed that he was stuck between two choices: either leave Rand in the hands of the Aes Sedai, or leave Elaine to the wolves' den of Tanchico.
This is the chapter to turn to if you are a confused rereader and you've just gotten to the end of the Towers of Midnight on your first read-through.
Yes.
There are very few direct interactions between the two of them like this in the series, and this is the only one I can think of that's from one of their points of view. So they do speak on page at other times, but not from her perspective that we covered anyway, that I can remember from our first season. And we're covering all of his point of view today, so this is the only time this happens. And it's just got the most phrases that you could mine for deeper meaning.
Yes.
And part of that meaning is that we know Moiraine already knows something about their future together. So she, I think, is being a little more bold and starting to initiate a little more kind of tension between them.
Right.
But I don't even remember catching that, when I read this a few months ago, when we were reading, when I was rereading to kind of catch up with our podcast in an earlier season. So it's all very subtle. These two are very subtle players at the great game. And it's really cool to see them both on screen here. It reminded me a lot of how epic it felt to have Varen and Matt face to face as well.
Yes, yes.
And I think it's good in the same way that it's good for that one, that we don't get much of this. It needs to be very special. It needs to be kind of legendary and leave us wanting more, because I think if there's too much of it on the page, it could be a little disappointing from these two characters that know too much, right? You can't get too much of their points of view.
Right. I mean, there are hints of things earlier. You can definitely see different times when they're in each other's heads, in each other's thoughts. They notice one another. They respect one another. He respects some of the things she does. She respects some of the things he does. But this is their direct interaction, face to face. The clash of the titans, if you would, the two characters, as you said, who know the most in this story, and face to face discussing their past, their future, their current interactions. And Moiraine has the added benefit of having already, I believe, gone through the Twisted Stone doorway, because she knows the name of the person she's going to marry. I think she had asked that for some reason. I don't know why. I don't know, why that would be one of the questions she had. She mentions to Egwene not long after this. I bet I know the face of the man I'm going to marry better than you do.
Yeah.
When Egwene's accusing her of not having any emotions and being someone without passion, without any. I can't even remember exactly how she worded it, but Moiraine came back at her with that. I know a lot about emotion. I know a lot about love, and I know more about better know the face of the man I'm going to marry than you do yours. So
yes, I wonder if that was a very clever question on her part to try to get at how long she survives in this lead up to the last battle. I wonder if she didn't just directly ask, who am I going to marry? But I think she might have asked something about her future that will give her a clue to whether she's going to live past the last battle, because you can't directly ask them about things related to the shadow. And the last battle is a little too risky. Anything about the dragon is a little too risky. I don't think love was on her mind at all. But I think that was just something to figure out enough about her lifespan and whether she would be able to support the dragon in what he needed to do.
Oh my goodness. I never thought of that, but that would be Moiraine's thought process, wouldn't it? Yes, she would be several steps ahead.
And very single-minded about it. Yes. She wouldn't be asking that just for her personal benefit.
Right. She would not waste a question like that. I had not considered that, but I think you're right. That's very perceptive. This is before the point where Rand and Matt have both gone into the Twisted Stone doorway, and she met them there. And I don't think you can go through twice, so the timing is a little odd to me. Unless she had gotten that information from somewhere else previously, prior to this.
Well, these chapters are not always in chronological order. I don't think. I think in the early books they were. I think they start to fragment later once you start adding more points of view. But I also think she could have gotten this from one of Min's visions too, and that could be something where she didn't ask a Finn question for that.
That's very, very likely. I didn't think of that. That maybe Min had seen her, with a gleeman or something, in a marriage ring or something, whatever images she would have. Right. I never considered that, but that's very possible because, as far as the chronology, we know Matt has not gone through yet. It's a day or so after when Egwene finally tells him, and I can't. Moiraine, did she step out of the doorway and catch Matt and Rand, or did she just walk down the hallway to the doorway? I think she stepped out of it, didn't she?
I think so. As many times as we've covered that scene, I think I should know this by now, but I don't.
Yeah, I'm going to have to reread that. Yes, because two read-throughs the series and the break down the study of Matt and I'm not 100% sure of the image of that, but I think she steps out of the doorway.
I think so too.
So you're right. She might have gotten this from Min Farshaw or some other means, but yeah, I just think it's cool that she knows for sure he's going to survive Tanchico.
Yeah,
and she can say that without any lies. When he mentions how dangerous the place is, intriguing that she'll dance around subjects and they'll have this conversation that every sentence is laden with double meanings, and they say one thing but with the intention of making the other person think something else, and not in a deceptive way, but to they don't have to finish the sentence. In other words,
Yeah.
she can say a little bit about his history, and he knows she's been digging deep, and he starts saying, how much else does she know?
Right.
And then he returns the favor, and so she knows he knows more than he's saying. So they say one sentence, and they know it makes the other person finish that thought 2 or 3 paragraphs ahead.
Yes. And there are the implications of threats. They have this almost mutually assured destruction of information they could... I mean, it's blackmail. So
right.
It's nice to see them doing that. And I think she was doing it from the moment they met in the first few chapters of The Eye of the World, actually. She kept calling him Master Bard at the time. She's been sitting on this information for a while.
Yes, she had more information. Now, we don't know that she had this much...
Right.
That she hit him with tonight, and everything about his nephew and all of that, how she got all of that, how she tied that information together, we will never know. But it really shocked Thom.
Mm-hmm.
And he was fighting to keep that off his face. But after that last one about Owen, ask her just to leave. Please, just leave. Because he didn't want her to see him cry. And she didn't. He held that in until she had left.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure she knew that impact. It was a big power move. She wanted to get him vulnerable.
Yes. And you wonder how vulnerable she was after this.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps this conversation is the catalyst that caused her to go on through the twisted stone doorway that she already knew was there, and to glean more information, to try to fill in those missing spaces, those missing pieces of the puzzle that she hasn't put together yet. As you said, concerning the future, concerning Rand and his trajectory, and there's only so much she can ask. But I can imagine Moiraine asking some very important questions. She didn't waste one for sure.
Yeah. I also wonder...
very, very well thought out.
Do you think she arranged to be caught? Was she really that sloppy and didn't notice someone approaching in time to do anything about it? Or did she want to catch him off balance? Like, yes, I have every right to be all up in your business like this, to have him off balance.
I didn't think of that. My thought was, okay, he's not here. Let me just go through some of his things and look at the papers he had laying out. And I was taking it at face value that she was doing that.
Right.
And that when he caught her, she was just so serene. She was not going to look guilty. She was not going to give away anything, because the worst thing you could do is turn around and be defensive or have a guilty look.
Yeah.
And so, being a masterful player that she was, she just kind of looks at him like, oh, there you are, and just, straighten her skirts and sit down and start talking with him as if she had every right to be there. But yeah, I'd never considered that, but I think you're probably right that she wanted both. She wanted to glean the information. She wanted to see, is he the one that's been starting these rumors and among the nobles, and basically indirectly causing one noble to murder another one.
Yeah.
And then that one's wife to begin the process of poisoning him. I mean, Thom knew something like that would happen. He didn't know the specifics because, again, he didn't have his fingerprints on anything. But
yep.
to see his ability to copy someone's handwriting and signature to the point that they would swear they wrote it themselves. I mean, he's a master, and I love seeing Thom, at the height of his craft like this. And we've talked about it before. I think in Ibu Dar, when he was going to try to make an official stamp out of a turnip, and his ability to just do that, it means he's done it before. And to have that kind of artistic flair, Thom is he is the Leonardo da Vinci of the Third Age. He can do pretty much anything he puts his mind to.
I've got one more question about motives in this chapter. I find it really interesting that Moiraine offered to name names of the Red Ajah who had extrajudicially gentled Owen.
Right.
From what we know of her, that is consistent with her, shaky loyalty to the White Tower that we have known about since New Spring. Her
Yes.
true loyalty is to the cause of the dragon. She's going to sell out the image of the White Tower. She's going to sell out whatever, whoever she needs to, in service of that dragon mission. So, I mean, we know that she has no love for any of these Red Sisters, but an Aes Sedai shouldn't turn over White Tower secrets like that. That's a
Right.
matter that should be handled internally.
Right.
Of course. And it's a lot like the way Siwan offers something very similar to Logain in Saladar. But I had forgotten completely about Moiraine's offer here until I read it for this episode,
Yes.
because I don't think this comes up again.
No,
At all.
I don't believe that it does, or at least I don't recall it. And I'm like you, I didn't remember it until we were reading for this episode. It's like, yeah, that's right, she did do that. As far as her motivations, she is loyal to the White Tower, and I believe she's actually doing this out of a sense of loyalty to the White Tower, because remember, being a blue sister, if she believes in causes, and one of those causes would be justice. And if the Red Sisters did something that was completely against Tower law, and they were let go, and that's what it sounded like here. So if I probably can't find the direct quote this quickly, but she says something about they should not have been pardoned, or should not have been, I don't remember exactly how she said it, but basically they were not punished for breaking Tower law. It was just let go, and that should not have happened. So in her mind, they've done this. There's probably been a pattern of some of these sisters doing that, some of these Red Sisters, and going completely unpunished by it. The Tower just turns a blind eye to it. So in her mind, it would actually be justice if someone else made them pay for their crimes. Because, again, that's a cause of keeping the Tower pure, holding all sisters accountable, because Moiraine knows she's going to be held accountable for all the things she does. She breaks Tower law, she breaks tradition, but she has that opinion, take what you want and pay for it later. And I'm not going to complain when I have to pay for it. So she's not going to complain if somebody else has to pay for their mistakes as well. That's my take on it. I may be wrong, but that's my take. And now in my personal headcanon, she probably knows one of those sisters is Elida, and we love to hate Elida. So,
right.
That's my personal headcanon. I'm not saying that's part of the story. I'm just saying that's me. I want it. I want this to be her way of preemptively sticking her finger in Elida's eye.
yeah, I could see that. I think, I mean, I said this was my last question about motives, but now this has brought up some more for me. I was thinking, why doesn't this come up again? Why do you think Thom doesn't try to call in this favor, or she doesn't bring it up again? Like, why does this piece of the story seem to get dropped?
I don't know. It would have been a great distraction along the timeline, when you have to make everything line up so everybody has a dozen side quests.
Yeah.
That would have made a good one. But you're right, that was just dropped. Again, just taking things at face value, Thom, even though he feels so much guilt over what happened to Owen, I think in his mind, he's not that interested in retribution against them. If he can protect the young boys he's around now, in his mind, that will assuage his guilt more than taking vengeance against those people who did Owen wrong. And perhaps he doesn't care so much for Tower law as whether or not they took him to Tarvalon for the trial or gentled him there on the spot. That's the whole point, is that they gentled him and they destroyed his life, and he would have died either way. Even had they taken him to Tarvalon for a trial, he would have been gentled and would have probably died there. So it wouldn't have changed much, except perhaps the cruelty of the townspeople who couldn't see beyond the fact that he could no longer channel and he was no longer a threat. But yeah, barring that, I don't know that it would have made any difference if they had followed Tower Convention.
I think you bring up some great points. I thought that maybe Thom was motivated by this incentive at first, but he may not even be that motivated by it in the first place, like you said, by a quest of vengeance. I mean, we have seen him go on quests of vengeance already, but I think that maybe let's say it was motivating to him, though, I think that he loses that still over time. I think that, he ends up getting intrinsically motivated. He no longer needs an external kind of motivator to protect Elaine and Nynaeve. Once he's
Right.
on this quest in Tanchico with them, he starts to really care about them.
Yes.
And
Yes.
he starts to have this bond with Elaine again.
Oh yeah.
And I also think that, it might have come up again. It seems like something Moiraine might have dangled at some point to use Thom for her own ends. But, and also just to try to give him something that might be a gift to him, because she seems to want to start to build that bond with him. But I think that she's taken out of the story a little too early to really make that happen, because they've both been so busy up until she tackles Lanfear through the doorway at the end of the Fires of Heaven. And so I just don't know that there was ever even an opportunity in the timeline for it to happen.
Right. Right.
Because once you mentioned all the side quests, I thought, yeah, how would you even make that line up? I can't even imagine a scenario where it really happened.
Well, I think half of the side quests are just to make the timelines add up. Some of them are, it's like, why do we do this? Well, we got to do something with them for the next 3 months. So, yeah, let's stick them over here in this town for a while. So,
True.
Yeah, standing in the snow, snaring at armies. That whole book is basically a non-event. So was dropped. But yeah, I guess it became unnecessary because after a while, Thom was there or a part of the story because he was a part of the story. He was a part of what's going on. He didn't need the extra motivation. Now, we discussed how off screen in our last or following our last episode, he killed King Galdrian and began the Kyrian Civil War. I mean, trouble was brewing anyway. The riots had started that night. The Dark Friend attack upon Barthanes' keep. That triggered a lot of things. He basically used that as a distraction and probably enhanced the Civil War, but it might have happened anyway without Thom's interference. We don't know. But it's hinted here by Moiraine that he might have killed Tarangale. So just right before Tarangale was considering making himself king, getting rid of Morghese and making himself the first king of Camlan. And my ears perked up at that one. When I read it, I had recalled it from before, but I had completely dropped that in my mind. I guess ever since, hadn't really thought about it. Even with the discussions of Ravine, who was using Morghese and kind of basically setting himself up as a king, knowing that the nation of the nation of Andor would not accept a king; they had to have a queen. Ravine was trying to pull that off. Tarangale before him had tried to pull off the same thing. Both of them trying to get rid of Morghese, incidentally, to become the first king. So yeah, it's one of those quips that's just thrown out there, and I don't remember it from any other part of the story. But it really perked me up. It's like Galdrian is not the first king he has assassinated. So he's had practice at this.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those times that I find it interesting that the characters don't acknowledge some of their relationships to each other, and it makes me wonder whether Robert Jordan had not quite had all the family trees mapped out the way he wanted at the time of writing this book, or if there just wasn't a relevant opportunity to include some of this stuff. But he could have turned around and said, "Oh, you mean your cousin Tarangale? Or what is it, like her half brother or something, right?" Okay.
No, half brother. No, he did say. He did, yeah. When he was giving her lineage, Moiraine Damodred of House Damodred, and so and half brother or half sister to Galt.
Yeah, okay.
I'm saying the wrong names, and mention your half brother Tarangale.
Okay,
so,
yeah.
He knew that. He brought that up. So that
I actually missed that. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's still, I guess my point still stands in some other scenarios because Moiraine and Elaine never talk about being related.
Right.
And nobody is ever like, "Hey, I heard this rumor that old man you're hanging out with killed your dad, Elaine. What's up with that?"
Yes.
Just interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I never thought of that part, that She has this fondness uh, for Tom. You can barely remember tugging on his mustaches when she's a little baby or an infant or toddler, whatever the case may be. But he's the one that probably killed her father. Yes, wow. Um, these things are so interwoven and interrelated. You know why he refers to the lives of men as the pattern, because the story
Yeah.
is definitely interwoven that way.
Well, I think I've covered all my points about this chapter and then many others that I didn't realize I had. How about you?
Yes, that's it. I think you have some other chapters you want to
Okay.
touch on from A Memory of Light.
Yes, I do. And similar to how I started this episode, I'm going to give a little synopsis of what Tom has been up to in the meantime so that we don't skip too many books without context here. In the rest of the Shadow Rising, Tom goes to Tanchico with Elaine and Nynaeve. Just as Moiraine predicted, he does survive the trip. He helps them hunt for the Black Aja. They rescue the Panarch Amathera. They retrieve the male Adom. And remember, they give them to Egyanin and Bael Doman. Think that's the end of it. And then in the Fires of Heaven, he and Julian rescue Elaine and Nynaeve from a village near Amadisha. And then they all join the circus. Then they pick up Brigitta in the circus plot, and then they take a ship to Saladar, where they stay for a while. And then Tom basically doesn't do anything in Lord of Chaos until the very end, when he goes to Ebudar with Elaine, Nynaeve, Matt, and company. And then he doesn't really do anything for several books. Crown of Swords, Path of Daggers, Winter's Heart, basically no mentions of him. But in Crosswords of Twilight, he ends up in the circus again. And when he's attached to Matt's story, they're using the circus to escape from Ebudar. And then in Knife of Dreams, he shows his Moiraine letter to Matt, and they start forming a plan for the Tower of Genji rescue. In The Gathering Storm, he's along for the ride when they go to Hinderstap, and he helps Matt plan the takedown of the Golem. He ends up getting raised back to his position as Camelin Court Bard by Elaine, who then pardons him of all his crimes in Andor and Cairhien as well. And then he goes on the Moiraine rescue mission. He is instrumental in this. He carves the symbol for them to enter the Tower of Genji. He plays the music to distract the Eelfinn. He also burned his hands picking up Moiraine from the mist surrounding her. And then he covered her in his Gleeman's cloak. Throughout the mission, he was using that music to dazzle and then later to mourn their apparently imminent doom before Matt cuts their way out with the Ashendari. And then once they're safe outside the tower, he agrees to Moiraine's 2 proposals. 1, that she bonds him as a warder, and 2, that they get married. And now we find him supporting her story in the last battle. Moiraine and Nynaeve are inside the Pit of Doom at Shale Ghul, linked in a circle with Rand so that he can wield Kalendor against Moradin and the Dark One. Tom is sitting outside the entrance, where we find him now in chapter 44 of A Memory of Light, called 2 Craftsmen. The chapter actually begins with a Perrin perspective, who's one of the 2 craftsmen named, and then after Perrin's healing and re-entry into the world of dreams, we switch to our Tom perspective, where he's sitting outside the entrance to the Pit of Doom, pondering what a uniquely good view he has on the entire last battle. He can almost see some movement in the cave, and down below he can see Windfinders and Dreadlords wresting lightning away from each other, Aiel fighting their corrupted red-veiled kin, and Darkhounds tearing their way through the defenders of Shale Ghul. Neither side has a clear advantage for very long. Tom keeps trying to find the right words for a ballad describing the occasion, but he's worried about using words that are really overdone. He wishes, too, that he could see and support Moiraine in the cave, but all he can do is feel her through the water bond and smile at her determination to face the end of the world with such grace. He keeps taking in the scenes of the battle and mulling over different adjectives to describe the experience. He has no idea how long it's been raging. He has slept for 5 or 6 times maybe since arriving at Shale Ghul, but he's not really sure if that amounts to days because he can't see the sun due to the weird battling clouds overhead. There was heroism and fear embedded into every aspect of the scene, so how could he convey all of that? He finally settles on exquisite, but there's certainly horror all around him too. In the midst of all of this horror, he does not regret choosing to stay with Matt and Rand. Could he really have hunkered down in an inn somewhere through the last battle and missed the most momentous opportunity for later storytelling? Then he noticed Cadsuane limping up the slope toward him. The woman nodded at him and started into the pit, but Tom just casually drops her with a knife to the back, revealing her to be a Black Aja member in disguise. As he stuffs her body, the 5th such, into a crevice in the rocks, he shakes his head at the poor attempts. The walk gave it away every time. He glanced into the cave, drawing some comfort and satisfaction from the motion, though he could not see anything in there. And then he took out parchment and a pen to begin composing. And thus ends chapter 44, Two Craftsmen, but Thom's final point of view is only a brief paragraph in chapter 48 called A Brilliant Lance, in which he, along with many other characters, witnesses a beam of light break through the top of the mountain into the sky, finally piercing the clouds. His final scene in the book is in Moiraine's last point of view, when she and Nynaeve run out of the pit of doom as that blinding light envelops the cave. Thom catches his wife to keep her from falling off the mountainside, and thus we have an ending to Thom's story in the Wheel of Time.
Oh, wow. This is a huge jump when you go from the Shadow Rising to A Memory of Light.
Yeah.
and
That's why I had to give the little synopsis of the rest of the books, because I
yes.
realized I don't remember what the heck else Thom has done.
Right. Yeah, I started to say that was a very brief synopsis to cover several books there, and all of the things from Saladar on. I mean, he was there in the thick of quite a number of events that happened. So, yeah, very good synopsis of that before you got to the chapter. This several things kind of rolled into this chapter 44. One of those is so classic Thom, to stand there at the edge of the end of the world, right on the cusp of either winning or losing, and he's composing a ballad, but he's doing it with all the subtlety that he was doing before with his letters of intrigue and they trying to manipulate the lords in the Stone of Tyr, because he can't just choose this word. No, that's overused. That word, no, that's too mundane. And he keeps going through all of these words before he settles on exquisite, because with Thom there has to be a sense of refinement to it.
I like that he's still got this fussy pretentiousness here at the end of the world.
yes, exactly. Any other bard or gleeman who would happen to have seen such a thing would have grown as verbose as they could. But with Thom, the subtlety, it's got to be exact. It's got to be, it can't be overdone and overblown. You can't overstate it. You can't understate it. You have to find that perfect balance. So that's one of the things that to me really encapsulates his personality, is that attention to detail. The other is the physical attention to detail that he pays when he sees Cadsuane walking up to him. Now, we discussed this before, but it was from Mat's perspective. I believe it was when Mat was going back into Ibu Dar after he'd already lost his eye, and he was going in to try to quote unquote rescue Tuon from her own nation. Rescue her from being empress, and found out there were assassins looking for her. So we talked about how Mat, he could put on a disguise, and even Petra didn't recognize him. Yet anybody who saw him walk could tell he was a soldier. He was a deadly person. Yeah. They assumed he was an assassin. And we talked about that physical sense of awareness that some people have. Some people can look at someone and know, that guy, if he looks like he's out of shape, but he can handle himself in a fight. There are special forces and people who are trained to look for these little telltale signs in the way a person moves or the way they walk, to know that this is a person I need to really watch out for. They know how to handle themselves. They know how to fight. They're very athletic, and so therefore, they're going to be a tougher target than the two who look tougher. So I see that in Thom, although I don't know how he's gained these skills, probably in a lot of bar fights over the years. And he's seen who is really dangerous and who isn't, or he can see through a lot of disguises, because no matter how a person dresses or acts, the way they carry themselves physically makes a big difference. And here he's got 5 or 6 bodies of people he has killed, people who are in disguise with a mask of mirrors, who were a perfect imitation and copy of the person they were impersonating, as far as appearances, probably voice, if they chose to do that and were skilled enough, but they couldn't change the walk. And
Yeah.
that means Thom has not spent a lot of time around Cadsuane that I can remember, but enough that he could tell that was not her just
He
by the
knows
way
what
this
type of
person
person
walked.
she is, what type of
Right.
possession she would have. And the fact
Yeah.
that this said limping up the slope, when
Yes.
you reread it, that's a red flag. And I'm sure it was for Thom, but he didn't let on in his thoughts consciously to the reader that that's what was
Right.
happening. I think a lot of people have mentioned that this was they thought it might have been, for a moment there, a last minute Thom is a dark friend reveal, that he just killed an Aes Sedai like this outright, so casually.
Just offhand.
And yeah. Until you see that mask of mirrors drop and know what's going on.
Right.
So I thought it was a nice fake out in that
Yes.
regard.
And I will say
but
it caught me on my reread because I had forgotten that detail. So, whoa, he did what? A knife into her spine. Wait a minute.
Yeah. He Sanderson wrote it in such a way that you do have to reread it.
Yeah,
It's so sudden. It's just like those when the gray men show up, and they're just kind of inserted into the scene where you see the people aren't thinking much about them. They're just kind of looking over them. Oh, there's a candlestick and there's some stack of books and some guy creeping towards me with a knife. And then they're like, a guy with a knife,
Yes.
And so that's kind of how I had to read this one. But it's interesting just how cold and casual he is with it. She dropped like a sack of potatoes. Well, that's overused. He goes immediately back to just mulling over the words, and that's the thing he's fussing over.
Yes.
He is scared, but he's not really thinking as much about that. He's not even thinking about his momentous responsibility of guarding the pit. Most of his energy is on the wording of his song or story or whatever that he's writing, and he's not even going to let killing a dark friend take much of his energy. Just like the energy that it takes to throw the knife and stuff the body in the hole, that's it, and he's right back to what he's doing.
Right.
It's just that casualness just reminds us he is incredibly dangerous. We are not going to forget that about him.
So much so that he didn't even give her a suspicious look, or that dark friend probably would have attacked him first. But he could look so casual, so accepting, like, oh, hi, Cadsuane, come on through, just with a glance, and have his attention apparently somewhere else on the words, on the battle, that they didn't, they totally did not suspect him of catching on to them. I don't have a poker face. Had it been me, they would have seen my eyes widen in surprise, and then I would have eaten a fireball, and that would have been the end of it. But Thom, thankfully, is good enough that he doesn't have that little telltale sign of surprise or anything. He rolls with it. But then it makes me wonder, what if he had been wrong, and Cadsuane or someone else had been injured and was limping? But I guess there still would have been different things about the walk, because there really are, people carry themselves different physically, and there really are differences in how people move and how people walk, and just the fact that he can pick up on that with that much certainty, it makes me love Thom. So many things about him.
Same.
Now, it's something I had not thought of until you mentioned it, I think probably in our first season, that how many of our characters have the potential to go very, very bad. And we see that in Thom here too. Again, he's a good man. He wants to be a good man. He doesn't want to use his powers to do evil or take over the world or even serve his own needs and desires. But he could. And had Thom wanted to go bad, he wouldn't have the supernatural gifts and powers that Rand or Egwene or some of the others have, or even the Ta'veren powers of Mat or Perrin. Yet he had the potential to take down pretty much any king or kingdom. He has the potential to take over if he wishes to manipulate most anyone he wants to manipulate. He could have become a force for evil if he'd just chosen to do so. So
I guess he's Asmodean on a different path. If he had decided, well, I want to use my assassin school degree that I've got on top of my music degree here to live forever. I could do that. I have the tools that I can bargain with the Dark One. Hey, I'll let you hire me out for assassin purposes if you'll let me make music for eternity.
Right, right. Yeah, he
Yeah.
could. Yeah, I'd never thought of comparing him to Asmodean, but that's a very good comparison. My mind instantly went to Saruman.
Yeah.
That that still surprises me. After this many years of familiarity with the Lord of the Rings, that's one of those that still surprises me somewhat. And the only reason I compared him to Saruman is because in the beginning he was sort of our Gandalf in a way, the old man who knew so much, who was helping to lead these young men on this quest.
Mm-hmm.
At least that was the direction our minds went. You see the old white-haired man who
Yeah.
seems to know so much, and he's going along with them. And then, of course, all of that changes. Moiraine is the one who's really leading them and protecting them, and we see Thom take a back seat to her. But yeah, if you'd had in mind from the beginning that he was the Gandalf of the story, he could have been the Saruman of the story. But
Yeah.
thankfully, he was not. And again, it makes him that much more endearing of a character when you see the potential of what could have been.
Absolutely. I think that you bring up a really good point that fits well with something I had wanted to bring out from this small point of view, is that you said he has all this potential, but he's still chosen to do good with it. And I think I want to bring into focus his reflection on his own sense of agency, because he thinks back with no regrets about helping Matt and Rand all throughout the series.
Mm.
It's interesting that, we saw what happened every time he tried to not be involved. So it's not clear to me how much Tom's help to the boys was his own conscience that he, again, like Matt, doesn't like to admit that he has, or how much of it was ta'veren pulling or something like that. And so Thom considered, and I think he believes to some extent, that it was the ta'veren angle keeping him involved in Rand's story. But it seems here that when Thom looks back on everything, he chooses to think of himself as having chosen to help Matt and Rand. Even though we can't know for sure whether it was just kind of that swirling ta'veren, it just makes me think of how in our own lives we could be just as uncertain about what degree of choice we have had in some of the ways that our lives have unfolded, but it's actually really good and healthy psychologically to look back the way Thom does and thinking that you had the choice there and deciding that it was a good choice to make and that you don't regret it, and that, or maybe even if it was bad stuff that happened to you, that it still brought you to a place that you're supposed to be now.
Mm.
So I think that Thom gets this amount of closure, it seems like, on all these hardships that he's been through to help the boys. So it's just a really cool bit of closure to have on his storyline, to see him reflecting in that way. And it's just a very brief line in the midst of, thinking about the wording and everything else that he's doing right now. But I really liked seeing that tidbit.
Yes, yeah, I do too. I hadn't really picked that out, but that is a good way to sort of close out the character, to close out his part of the story. Um, as far as the ta'veren pull and all these things, I mean, Thom has experienced a little bit of that, and there were times that he was caught in their orbit and couldn't escape. But I think it was less him and possibly more his nephew Owen, because had Owen not had the power, been born able to channel, and had been gentled and died, Thom would not have been so emotionally invested in the boys, and would have been much easier for him to turn away earlier. So you can almost see
Yeah.
the impassionate, impartial pattern, gifting Owen with the gift to channel, just to affect Thom's life later. Or perhaps the
Yeah.
ta'veren pull acts that way and brings us coincidences about years before the ta'veren is even born. I don't know. It's always a little mysterious as to whether the ta'veren changes the pattern or the pattern changes the ta'veren. But
Yeah.
I think that's intentional. But yeah, it's one of those kind of metaphysical things to wonder about. Did these things happen years and years? Well, it would have been before they were born. I think he said 15 years
Oh,
old.
yeah,
So,
true.
but anyway, these things would have happened before our story began in the eye of the world. just to bring this about later and bring things about this way. So I think it's altogether possible, but so it's affected the circumstances of Tom's life more than it directly affects Tom's decisions. So he's given more free will and agency than some of the other characters. And like you said, it speaks volumes for his internal, I started to use the word character, but we're using that to describe the person, but who he is, that he chooses to help them and does not regret that choice more than looking back and saying, well, I was kind of forced into it, but I accepted it. It was okay. He was like, no, I'm glad I chose to help them. So I hadn't looked at it that way, but you're right. That was a very good closing statement, for his part of the story.
I think so, yeah. And that's really about all I've got on his perspectives in A Memory of Light. No. Did you have anything else?
No, just that Thom is one of the wonderful, beloved characters. There's many of them, and we're going to talk about a few more. Most of these, of course, as we've said before in this bonus season, this half season, are people who are friends of Matt or people who've been around him since last season focused on Matt. So I hope everyone will join us next time for our interlude episode number 3, where we'll begin reading Egionan's point of views in chapters 38 and 46 of The Shadow Rising.
There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of mind, but this is an ending. To catch a beginning next time an episode drops, subscribe to Wheel of Mind on Podbean, Stitcher, iTunes, or Spotify. You can also find our episodes on YouTube under the channel name Lajaradane. That's Lajaradayne. We love to hear how we're doing, so leave us some feedback by rating and reviewing on whichever podcast platform you listen to. You can contact us by emailing lajaradane@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter @mind_wheel. To support the show and get access to some perks, subscribe to us on Patreon for just $3 a month by visiting patreon.com/wheelofmind.